Welcome. Today, we're turning our attention to a case that is um, both profoundly tragic and just incredibly complex from a legal standpoint.
It really is.
We're going to be examining the 2010 murder of Audreanna Zimmerman. And our purpose here, just to be very clear, is not to cast judgment.
No, not at all.
It's to conduct a thorough, impartial analysis of the facts as they're laid out in the legal documents and reports surrounding this horrific crime, which took place in Ensley, Florida.
We are absolutely navigating a difficult and a very sensitive subject here. And we do acknowledge the gravity of the source material we're working with. Our objective is purely a factual exploration. We're going to be meticulously looking at the timeline of the attack, the legal proceedings that followed, which stretched over more than a decade, and of course, the current status of the three women who were convicted.
So the core event, it occurred on March 24th, 2010. Audreanna Zimmerman, who was only 19 years old at the time, was subjected to a brutal, really calculated attack. It involved a severe beating and then arson.
And she fought for her life in the hospital for 16 days. It's unimaginable. She succumbed to her injuries on April 9, 2010.
And the immediate aftermath of that crime led to one of the most, I think, legally fascinating and, frankly, heartbreaking outcomes we've ever covered.
I'd agree. We're dealing with three perpetrators here. Tina LaSonia Brown, Heather Trainee Lee, and Brittany Angelique Miller. All of them convicted for the same crime,
Right.
but they received wildly divergent sentences. I mean, you have Brown, who received the death penalty, Miller, who was sentenced to life in prison, and then Lee, who received 25 years.
That spectrum of outcomes it's just staggering.
It is, and it requires us to look really closely at every single stage of the legal process to understand how the system arrived at such different conclusions for people who are, all responsible.
And that's really the crux of our analysis today. We're going to explore how cooperation, how age, and how constitutional law all intersected to produce these dramatically different results.
Okay.
So let's unpack the relationships that existed before this tragedy. The sources confirm that Audreanna Zimmerman, Tina Brown, Heather Lee, and Brittany Miller were not strangers.
No, not at all. They were neighbors. They were all living in surrounding trailers in an Escambia County mobile home park.
So that proximity suggests a history, but that history had clearly turned venomous by early 2010.
Well, what the investigation established was that this was a targeted act. It was rooted in a really intense personal conflict. The relationship had severely deteriorated, particularly between Audreanna Zimmerman and Brittany Miller.
And Brittany Miller was the youngest of the convicted women.
She was just 16 at the time.
The sources detail a really critical precursor incident. It's one that, in the eyes of the prosecution, established a very clear motive for the later attack. Zimmerman had been caught having a sexual involvement with Miller's boyfriend.
And that was the catalyst. When Miller attempted to confront and strike Zimmerman over this, Zimmerman used a stun gun to defend herself.
An act of self-defense.
An act of self-defense, yes. But that single act, perhaps, sealed her fate.
That confrontation, it really set the emotional stage, didn't it?
It created not just resentment, but a sense of almost an urgency for revenge among the three women, particularly Miller and the primary adult conspirator, Tina Brown.
So the violence that followed just days later was clearly planned.
Oh, absolutely. The evidence pointed to a very high degree of premeditation.
And this is where the narrative of March 24, 2010, it just becomes truly disturbing. The mechanism they used to initiate the violence was calculated deception.
Right.
Tina Brown, who was the oldest of the three, she lured Audreanna Zimmerman to her home under the manipulative guise of wanting to rekindle their friendship.
And the sources really note this. That calculated betrayal was instrumental in proving premeditation later on in court.
That specific element of luring is so crucial.
It is, because it immediately undercut any defense claims that this was, a spontaneous fight or some kind of accidental injury.
Right. Zimmerman arrived believing she was meeting a friend.
Exactly. And what she walked into was a coordinated ambush. The initial assault was immediate and it was brutal.
The initial assault, as detailed in the court documents, it involved all three of them, Brown, Miller, and Lee.
All three.
But the reports confirm that Tina Brown was the most actively violent participant. She used a crowbar to repeatedly beat Zimmerman.
And she also shocked her several times with a stun gun.
So this just demonstrates an intent to disable and severely injure the victim before the final fatal act even took place.
The initial charges, and then later the first-degree murder charges, they reflect the intensity and the nature of this staged violence. The use of multiple weapons, the crowbar, the stun gun, it indicates preparation and coordination.
Far beyond what you would classify as a mere physical altercation.
Absolutely. The level of violence directed at Audreanna Zimmerman was horrific, even at that early stage.
And then came the escalation, the abduction, and then the horrific act of arson.
After the initial beating, the sources confirmed the trio forcibly abducted Zimmerman, dragging her into a car.
They drove her to a remote location, a nearby forest, where they committed the final unspeakable act.
They doused her with gasoline and they set her on fire, and they left her for dead.
That sequence, the beating, the abduction, the use of fire as a weapon, it demonstrates a level of malicious intent and cruelty that is, it's just very difficult to process.
It is. And the decision to abandon a severely injured victim in a remote location, it speaks directly to their complete disregard for Audreanna Zimmerman's life.
And yet, despite the unimaginable suffering and the severity of her injuries, Zimmerman demonstrated just extraordinary strength and resilience.
The sources really stress this point.
She managed to escape the burning scene and make it to a nearby home where she was able to call 911 for help.
And this is perhaps the most critical moment in the entire legal saga.
How so?
Zimmerman was transported immediately to a hospital in Mobile, Alabama. She was treated for severe burns covering 60% of her body. And while the injuries were tragically fatal, the fact that she remained conscious.
She was lucid.
Exactly. She was lucid immediately following the attack. And that allowed her to provide a direct contemporaneous identification of her three attackers to the authorities.
That direct statement from her before she died would have been devastating evidence for the defense to try and overcome.
Absolutely. It transforms the case. It's no longer reliant purely on circumstantial evidence or forensics. Now it's supported by direct, unshakable victim testimony.
She fought for 16 days in the hospital.
16 days before succumbing to her injuries on April 9th, 2010, the medical examiner's report confirmed the cause of death was multiple thermal injuries.
And with the death of Audreanna Zimmerman, the legal landscape shifted dramatically.
It did. The charges were immediately upgraded. The trio was charged with first-degree premeditated murder, which is the most severe homicide charge in Florida.
And it carries the potential for capital punishment.
It does. The sheer weight and seriousness of the ensuing legal battles were all set in motion by the horrific nature of the crime and, critically, the victim's own identification of her attackers.
We mentioned the vastly different outcomes for the three perpetrators. The legal journey that followed reveals how factors like willingness to cooperate, the presence of direct evidence, and the defendant's age can lead to this whole spectrum of sentences for the same fatality.
The story of Heather Trainee Lee is the perfect starting point. She was the first to face proceedings, and she's the only one who secured a future release date.
Her case really illustrates the immense power of the plea bargain in the American justice system.
Without a doubt.
Lee's path was clearly defined by a single, strategic legal maneuver. On November 3rd, 2011, she pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of second-degree murder. So what was the prosecution's calculation here? Why reduce the charge from first-degree murder?
Well, the prosecution's calculation was entirely pragmatic. It was evidence-driven. While Audreanna Zimmerman had identified all three women, securing a first-degree murder conviction,
Which requires proving premeditation.
proving it beyond a shadow of a doubt against multiple actors that is always strengthened by internal corroboration.
So Lee agreed to testify.
She agreed to provide crucial, detailed testimony against her co-defendants, Tina Brown and Brittany Miller.
So her testimony became the key that locked in the convictions for the other two.
Precisely. In exchange for that testimony, the prosecution dropped the initial first-degree murder and the kidnapping charges. And most critically for Lee, the death penalty was completely taken off the table.
It's a trade-off.
It's a common feature in capital cases. You sacrifice the maximum possible punishment for one defendant to ensure the highest possible punishment for the most culpable defendant, which in this case, the state believed was Tina Brown.
And the result of that agreement was her sentence on July 20, 2012. 25 years in prison.
25 years.
In the context of the crime, that sounds severe, but compared to life or death, it represents a huge benefit that stems directly from her decision to cooperate.
It absolutely demonstrates the immense value the state placed on her evidence. Her 25-year sentence provided a guaranteed conviction on her part, and it allowed the state to focus its full resources on pursuing the capital conviction of Tina Brown.
Which brings us directly to her, Tina LaSonia Brown. She was the oldest and, according to the sources, the primary actor in that initial beating.
That's right. Her trial began before an Escambia County jury on June 18, 2012.
And unlike Lee, she did not cooperate.
No, she chose to challenge the charges. However, the evidence against her, which now included that compelling testimony from Lee, it was overwhelmingly strong.
The court documents confirm that the jury found 41-year-old Tina Brown guilty of first-degree murder on June 21, 2012.
And they did it after deliberating for a shockingly short period of time, just about an hour.
It seems remarkable. An hour for a capital murder case. Did that suggest the defense just utterly failed to create reasonable doubt? Or was the evidence simply insurmountable?
I think it speaks volumes about the clarity and the strength of the state's case. When a jury takes only 60 minutes to reach a verdict in a case where a human life is hanging in the balance, it typically means the evidence of guilt wasn't just strong, it was practically unassailable.
The premeditation.
The lure, the multiple weapons, the gasoline, that, coupled with the direct identification from the victim and the testimony of an accomplice, it just presented a unified and devastating narrative for the jury.
So following that swift guilty verdict, the trial moved into the penalty phase.
That's correct. Just 5 days later, on June 26, 2012, the same jury returned with their sentencing recommendation.
And what was it?
They unanimously recommended the death penalty for Tina Brown.
Unanimously.
Yes. And we should note that Brown reportedly offered an apology to Audreanna Zimmerman's family in court during this phase, but by that point, the jury had already been convinced of the gravity and premeditation of her actions.
And the formal sentencing followed a few months later.
On September 28, 2012, Circuit Judge Gary Burgosh formally accepted the jury's unanimous recommendation and sentenced Tina Brown to death.
A highly significant decision.
Very. It confirmed her status as one of the very few women on Florida's death row. Her conviction was held up locally as a major outcome secured by Assistant State Attorney Bridget Jensen at the time.
Okay, so finally, let's turn to Brittany Angelique Miller, the third perpetrator. Her story is fundamentally different because of her age.
Yes, she was only 16 at the time of the offense.
Miller also pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, the same charge Brown was convicted of.
She did, but the critical legal limitation here, the thing that shielded her from the death penalty, was her juvenile status. Florida law, which has been influenced by evolving constitutional standards, mandates that minors cannot be executed.
So the death penalty was off the table, but given the severity of her role, the state was still pursuing the maximum available punishment.
Precisely. On May 7, 2013, Miller was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Her age saved her from execution.
It did, but the mandatory sentencing requirements for first-degree murder at that time meant she was facing incarceration for the rest of her natural life. This mandatory life sentence, however, would be the very thing that would later trigger a complex series of appeals based on some landmark Supreme Court decisions.
When capital and life sentences are handed down, the initial trial is rarely the end of the legal journey.
That's right.
The appeals process is long, it's arduous, and it's constantly subject to evolving constitutional law and judicial scrutiny.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, appeals, especially in cases like these involving mandatory life sentences for juveniles or the death penalty, they are exhaustive. They're designed to ensure procedural fairness and constitutional compliance.
And for Brittany Miller, the focus was entirely on changes in juvenile sentencing law that happened after her initial conviction.
Exactly.
So let's start with Miller's attempt to withdraw her plea. This was in March 2017, years after she was sentenced. What was the core legal basis for trying to reverse a guilty plea?
Her defense argued a classic post-conviction claim that as a juvenile, she could not have fully understood the implications of pleading guilty to first-degree murder.
Okay.
Especially given the ongoing shifts in the legal landscape regarding mandatory life sentences for minors. Specifically, her lawyers were relying on the precedent set by the U.S. Supreme Court's 2012 ruling in Miller v. Alabama and the 2010 ruling in Graham v. Florida.
And those are landmark cases.
They are. Miller v. Alabama essentially found that mandatory life sentences for juvenile homicide offenders are unconstitutional.
Because juveniles are seen as inherently less culpable and have a greater capacity for rehabilitation.
Exactly. So Miller's defense leveraged this. They claimed her original plea agreement allowed her to withdraw the plea if the Supreme Court delivered a decision that was, in their words, beneficial to her.
Which would allow her to go back and face trial under a more favorable legal framework.
That was the goal.
But there was a conflict over the interpretation of the original plea language. What did the prosecution argue?
The state countered that the agreement only allowed for withdrawal if the subsequent decision was not beneficial. So this semantic argument became a key point of contention.
And what was the outcome?
Ultimately, Miller's bid to rescind her guilty plea was rejected by the courts that same month. Her original conviction stood, but her lawyers successfully forced the state to acknowledge the changing constitutional environments surrounding her sentence.
And that successful pressure led directly to her resentencing trial in October 2017. Why was this resentencing mandated if her guilty plea had been affirmed?
It was mandated to comply with the new constitutional requirements. Since her original sentence was mandatory life without parole, the very practice the Supreme Court had questioned, the court needed to conduct an individualized sentencing hearing.
And that hearing was critical.
Very critical because it required the judge to consider Miller's specific circumstances and ensure the life sentence was a proportional, not a mandatory punishment.
And this resentencing trial allowed the defense to present significant mitigating factors about her youth and her background.
They absolutely painted a picture of trauma. They were aiming to convince the court that her actions were a product of her troubled past, not inherent maliciousness.
What kind of evidence did they present?
The defense presented extensive psychiatric reports, evidence detailing her history of childhood abuse, abandonment, and sexual exploitation. They argued that these traumatic experiences profoundly limited her ability to reason and control her behavior at 16.
I recall the source material mentioned a particularly compelling argument about her motivation for the crime.
Yes, a central focus of the mitigation argument was that Miller committed the crime out of a deep desire for her mother's approval.
A desire for her mother's approval.
Yes. The defense linked this desperation for acceptance directly to her participation in the attack, arguing it mitigated her personal culpability.
And yet, despite all this evidence of mitigating circumstances, Circuit Judge Gary Burgosh maintained the life sentence on November 6, 2017.
He did. He affirmed the life sentence, stating that the sheer horror and premeditation of the crime still outweighed the mitigating factors. However, and this is a crucial however, the outcome was fundamentally different from her original sentence.
How so?
Recognizing her status as a juvenile offender, Judge Burgosh ruled that Miller was eligible for her first judicial sentencing review after 15 years.
So that crucial change meant the sentence was no longer technically life without parole.
Correct. It became a life sentence with a clear path for review after a decade and a half, which brought it into constitutional compliance. This ruling was later affirmed by the Florida First District Court of Appeal in April 2019.
The legal journey of Brittany Miller serves as a perfect parallel to the story of Tina Brown's appeals, though Brown's focused on the procedures of her capital case.
Right. And Brown's process spanned over a decade, from 2014 right up through 2024.
The initial wave of appeals for Brown, post-conviction, they met with pretty rapid resistance.
They did. Both the Florida Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court rejected her initial appeals against the conviction and the death sentence in 2014. These quick rejections are a common indicator that the highest courts found no immediate, glaring constitutional or procedural errors in the original trial.
But the appeals continued. In 2018, Brown filed a significant post-conviction motion claiming ineffective counsel. This is a claim we see often in capital cases.
It is. It suggests the defendant's constitutional right to a competent defense was violated.
What specific failures did her defense allege?
Her legal team alleged several critical failures. They claimed her original trial counsel failed to adequately investigate and present crucial mental health evidence that could have been mitigating. Furthermore, they argued counsel failed to interview specific witnesses who might have offered alternative theories of the crime or provided context that shifted culpability slightly toward her co-defendants. Brown also personally claimed that Heather Lee had a greater degree of culpability and she tried to discredit certain jurors.
These are broad, serious claims. They're designed to force a retrial. How did the courts assess these specific allegations?
Well, Circuit Judge Gary L. Burgosh denied this appeal in April 2019. The ruling stated that Brown failed to provide the necessary supporting evidence to prove that these alleged failures by her counsel, even if they were true, were significant enough to have actually changed the outcome of her trial.
So it's not enough to prove an error was made.
Exactly. In capital appeals, you have to prove not just an error, but a prejudicial error, one that was outcome determinative. The court found that the mountain of evidence against Brown remained overwhelming, rendering the counsel's alleged failings insufficient to warrant a new trial.
Her legal efforts continued into 2020 with a third appeal to the Florida Supreme Court,
Which was also dismissed quickly.
Then, years later, things intensified again in 2023 with a new post-conviction motion, this time focused on witness testimony.
This was a compelling last-ditch effort. Brown's lawyers filed a motion arguing that a key prosecution witness, a woman named Corey Doyle, had provided false testimony during the trial.
And they alleged she did so at the behest of Heather Lee.
Specifically, yes. They alleged that Doyle had been pressured or induced by Heather Lee, the woman who received the plea deal, to lie about certain events or conversations. The implication was clear.
If a crucial piece of testimony supporting Brown's conviction was tainted by perjury, it could raise reasonable doubt.
Especially regarding the final sentencing decision. A serious allegation like that, if it's proven, could certainly cast doubt on the reliability of the entire trial and potentially lead to the death sentence being vacated.
So the courts must have taken it seriously.
They did. They spent considerable time reviewing the substance of this claim. However, the final ruling came in May of 2024. Judge Burgash again rejected this appeal.
What was the reasoning?
His finding was that even if the new evidence concerning Doyle's disputed credibility was accepted, it did not raise a reasonable doubt sufficient to overturn Brown's conviction for first-degree murder. The totality of the evidence, the victim's identification, the physical evidence, Lee's overall corroborating testimony, it was just too strong.
So that 2024 ruling marked the latest and seemingly final judicial affirmation of Tina Brown's death sentence.
It appears so.
Years after the crime, after this relentless cycle of legal proceedings, it's necessary to examine the current status of these three women, particularly how broader legal changes in Florida have affected Tina Brown's status.
Brown's current status is highly significant because it really has to be viewed in the context of a dramatic change in capital punishment standards for women in Florida over the last decade.
So let's detail that change. By early 2017, the sources confirmed that Tina Brown was one of 5 women on death row at the Lowell Correctional Institution.
That small roster included Brown, Amelia Carr, Anna Maria Cardona, Margaret Allen, and Tiffany Cole. Over the subsequent 7 years, that list systematically dwindled.
And why was that?
It was primarily due to shifting constitutional requirements regarding jury participation in sentencing.
Can you elaborate on the legal mechanism that was driving these commutations and resentencings?
The major catalyst was the U.S. Supreme Court's 2016 ruling in Hurst v. Florida. The Hurst decision declared Florida's capital sentencing scheme unconstitutional because it allowed a judge, rather than a jury, to find the facts necessary to impose the death penalty.
And this eventually led to a requirement for a unanimous jury recommendation for death.
Exactly, and that led to numerous resentencing hearings across the state, including for the women on death row.
And we can see the immediate results of this legal shift in the sources. Amelia Carr's sentence, for example, was commuted to life without parole in June 2017.
That's right. Next, Anna Maria Cardona, whose case was one of the highest profile in Florida history, she was resentenced to life without parole in December 2017.
So by early 2023, the roster was down to just 3, Brown, Allen, and Cole.
And then another critical shift occurred. In August 2023, Tiffany Cole's death sentence was revoked, and she was resentenced to life imprisonment without parole.
And that was a direct result of her resentencing hearing.
It was. The new jury returned a majority decision of 10-2 to impose life, which failed to reach that required unanimous threshold for death,
leaving only Margaret Allen and Tina Brown under a death sentence.
And the final change, which solidified Brown's unique position, occurred late in 2024.
On December 13, 2024, Margaret Allen died of natural causes at the age of 58 while still awaiting execution.
And this singular development left Tina Brown as the sole remaining woman on Florida's death row.
So as of 2025, the forces confirm she is still incarcerated on death row at the Lowell Correctional Institution. She's exhausted her most significant state and federal appeals.
The courts have consistently upheld the finality of her capital sentence despite the legal turbulence that commuted the sentences of all her counterparts.
Now let's just briefly touch on the status of the 2 co-defendants, Heather Lee and Brittany Miller.
Heather Lee, who benefited from that plea deal, is currently incarcerated at the Gadsden Correctional Facility. Her cooperation secured her a charge of second-degree murder and a finite sentence.
And the sources provide a clear timeline for her future.
They do. Her projected release date is September 2, 2031. She will have served a total of 21 years when she is released.
A life-altering sentence for sure, but one that provides a clear future.
A contrast enabled only by her agreement to testify.
And Brittany Miller. She was 16 at the time of the crime, and her case led to this major discussion about juvenile sentencing.
Miller is currently serving her life sentence at the Lowell Correctional Institution as of 2025. While her initial sentence was life without parole, her successful resentencing in 2017 established that she is eligible for a judicial review after 15 years.
So that path means her life sentence is subject to reevaluation.
It is. But it remains a lifetime commitment to the correctional system unless that future review finds her suitable for release. You know, what stands out so clearly from this extensive look into the sources and the legal timeline is the principle that judicial outcomes, even for a single unified crime, are rarely uniform. The difference a plea agreement made for Heather Lee 25 years instead of life or death is a monumental illustration of the leverage the state holds.
And the complexity of constitutional law surrounding juvenile sentencing was the major determining factor for Brittany Miller.
It converted a mandatory life sentence into a reviewable one, even as her underlying conviction was affirmed.
And finally, Tina Brown's case serves as this profound example of the immense longevity and judicial scrutiny that's inherent in the capital appeals process. The courts consistently upheld her conviction.
Across multiple legal challenges, yes. Based on procedural complaints, claims of ineffective counsel, even new evidence suggesting witness misconduct.
The legal system determined her culpability, driven by that premeditated lure and the use of extreme violence, to be the highest.
The legal distinction between the three women, the cooperating witness, the juvenile offender whose path was altered, and the primary adult perpetrator who received the maximum punishment, it's a powerful illustration of the many variables that contribute to judicial outcomes in capital cases.
These sources really force us to observe how the legal system must grapple with not only the horrific nature of a crime like the murder of Audreanna Zimmerman,
but also the age and background of the perpetrators, trying to balance justice for the victim with the statutory requirements for punishment.
The case of Tina Brown, now the sole woman awaiting execution in the state of Florida, serves as a solemn marker of the legal system's finality in capital cases after years and years of exhaustive review. We encourage you to consider how these external legal shifts, like the Hearst ruling, can ripple through individual cases, even if ultimately they did not change Brown's final outcome.
It really shows that the law is not static. It's constantly evolving. It's pushing for greater scrutiny, but the bar for overturning a verdict that's been proven by such compelling evidence remains exceptionally high.
Thanks for listening.